Voters in Hungary have ousted the country's longtime Prime Minister Viktor Orban. The TISA party of center-right candidate Peter Magyar won the election in a landslide victory, garnering the two-thirds majority required to enact constitutional reforms. As you see right there in Budapest, Magyar's supporters celebrated his victory deep into the night. And European equities, they surged on the news of the election of a pro-European candidate. Peter Magyar just wrapped up a long 3-hour press conference. Let's take a listen to part of what he said.
We'll do everything in our power to ensure that this truly marks the beginning of a new era. For the Hungarian people did not vote for a mere change of government, but for a complete regime change.
It's all change at this metro station in Budapest as Hungarians celebrate the beginning of a new political era. The overwhelming victory of centre-right newcomer Peter Magyar after 16 years of rule by Viktor Orban's nationalists has come as a welcome surprise for many.
Genuinely unbelievable. We had Fidesz ruling for so long. I'm only 24. I essentially grew up with Fidesz. And now there is a glimpse of hope that we have a chance to change everything.
We weren't part of the European Union that much, and I really want to be part of the European Union. And so, I mean, I travel a lot, so it's very important for Hungarians, I think.
Many Hungarians hope Orban's defeat will unlock billions of euros in European Union funds that had long been frozen over concerns about Hungary's democratic standards.
For me, it's very important that we work intensively with the new Hungarian government on funds that have to be delivered, reforms that have to be delivered, but funds then that can be delivered because the Hungarian people deserve it.
German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said the clear election result highlights the resilience of democratic societies.
Right-wing populism suffered a heavy defeat in Hungary yesterday, and this does not only concern Hungary. A very clear signal is being sent out from Hungary against right-wing populism throughout the world.
Orban's defeat by his former colleague turned opposition challenger has deprived Moscow of a strong ally. The Kremlin's initial response was muted.
Hungary has made its choice, and we respect that choice. We expect to continue our highly pragmatic contacts with Hungary's new leadership. We've heard statements about a willingness to conduct a dialogue. Obviously, that will be beneficial for both Moscow and Budapest.
Respect and freedom is the full name of Peter Magyar's TISA party, and hopes are high, both within and outside Hungary, that that's exactly what it will deliver.
We have team coverage of this election. I'm joined now from Budapest by DW correspondent Ferenc Gaal and from Brussels, DW correspondent Rosie Birchard. To both of you, it's good to have you with us. I want to start with you, Ferenc. Voter turnout in Hungary's election was the highest since the collapse of communism back in 1989. What issue or issues brought the voters out?
I think the single biggest issue we need to focus on here is the economic one. Economy has really been on people's minds, on voters' minds here, not only because wages have been stagnant and low here in Hungary, but also because inflation has been high, the cost of living has been rising over the past months and years. And there are several other issues, like, of course, also, health infrastructure here has been underfunded for a while. That has bothered a lot of people. But especially the economy has been so important because for a long time, people felt they were doing well under this government, even though there were accusations of corruption. There have been accusations of corruption for years, but a lot of voters seem to be putting up with that, willing to put up with it because they felt economically they were also benefiting. This seems to have changed now. And another important factor we need to keep in mind is that Peter Magyar really managed to mobilize so many people also by campaigning heavily in rural areas, traveling the country sometimes with 5, 6, 7 stops a day, different villages, and targeting areas that had been Fidesz strongholds in the past. So this certainly also helped him to get this victory that has been such an impressive landslide that we've seen.
Rosie, we know also that this anti-corruption message, we know that it resonated with voters in Hungary. It was a message that European Union leaders in Brussels were more than happy to hear, wasn't it?
You bet it was. There is a hope among many EU officials and diplomats that have been speaking to press and that I've been speaking to that this is now the beginning of the end of the era of Viktor Orban as the EU's obstructor-in-chief. And I really cannot count how many EU meetings I have stood outside, reported on, where we have been covering Orban blocking some EU decision or other, whether that's with regards to sanctions against Russia, decisions on the European budget. Orban has been at loggerheads with Brussels on all sorts of issues and has regularly blamed the EU for all sorts of problems without, of course, thinking of withdrawing from the European Union, which is something that he could have done should he have wished to. Now, what's really striking is the enthusiasm that EU officials really seem to be willing to share. We heard Ursula von der Leyen saying that Hungarians are reclaiming a European path. But of course, it's worth noting that there are many people who are disappointed by this election result. Viktor Orban has plenty of allies within the European Union, and I think many of those members of that populist right-wing or far-right grouping will be looking at this election carefully and perhaps drawing some lessons. One of them may be to give the US Trump administration a wide berth, because how extraordinary was it to see US Vice President J.D. Vance jetting into Budapest, throwing his political weight behind trying to get Viktor Orban re-elected, and it was a failure. Orban lost in a landslide to his rival Peter Magyar.
So, Rosie, briefly, if you could, what is the European Union now expecting from Hungary?
Big anti-corruption reforms, and they've asked for swift progress. Given that Magyar has this supermajority, there will be expectations that he can deliver on trying to improve, for example, judicial independence, then unblocking some of those things that have been held up by Hungarian vetoes, the likes of a major €90 billion loan for Ukraine, which has been on the table and blocked by Orban, and also a new round of sanctions against Russia. There are some other things Orban had been blocking, for example, sanctions against some members of the Israeli government. Peter Magyar was pretty mealy-mouthed when asked about this today, and that's something I would say is we don't really know what his foreign policy orientation will be and what this means for Hungary's place in the world.
Yeah, Ferenc, you know, the euphoria of this election, some are saying, will soon be replaced by the sobering reality that Peter Magyar is not so different from Viktor Orban. Some are even saying that Peter Magyar is Viktor Orban 2.0. Is he?
Of course, at this point in time, it is hard to say. What we know that he shares a past that is not dissimilar to that of Viktor Orban, which is that he has, of course, been a Fidesz insider. He was part of that inner circle of that party. He was married to a former minister in the Fidesz government, and for many years he was just part of this whole system within and around the government. Now, there is also parallels if you look at that it's not a party that has very, very different views from Fidesz's original worldview. It is still a conservative movement and it is very strongly focused on him as a person, but really, the main difference, the main similarity, you could also say, to, for example, Fidesz in the early days is that it is such a strong grassroots movement as well. So there have been so many organizational units throughout the country where people have volunteered to join this party. So it really has a very strong voter base across the country, which is a parallel also to Fidesz in its early days, which was, you know, a young democratic movement after communism in Hungary. But then, of course, now, with this two-thirds majority that Peter Magyar got, it is a massive chance, but it also carries a lot of responsibility and, frankly, risks, of course, because, as you mentioned earlier, it could enable him, and it does enable him and his government to institute constitutional reforms, and that, of course, you know, just simply carries risks. And this is where the fears come in that he might turn out to be a politician that also takes advantage of these risks. We don't know simply at this stage, but this is certainly something that some people here in Hungary and also outside of Hungary fear, and we'll have to keep an eye on it, how things develop.
That's right. As they say, time will tell. DW correspondent Ferenc Gaal in Budapest and our correspondent Rosie Birchard in Brussels. To both of you, thank you. And for more on Peter Magyar's election victory and what it means, I'm joined now by Daniel Hegedus. He's a senior visiting fellow with the German Marshall Fund and deputy director of the Institute for European Politics in Berlin. Daniel, it's good to have you with us. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz, he says that Magyar's victory shows right-wing populism suffered a heavy defeat in Hungary. Is that the right way to look at it?
Yes, I think this is a right way to see it. Actually, the Hungarian government of Prime Minister Orban has been a vanguard of autocratization and illiberal politics, both in the European Union, but lately also at transatlantic stage. And now the 16 years of illiberal rule was put to an end by a landslide election victory that we can also categorize as a sort of democratic revolution on the part of the Hungarian society.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a strong statement to lay out there, that this is a democratic revolution. You know, Peter Magyar used to be part of Viktor Orban's Fidesz party. So I'm wondering how much of a break in political tradition does he really represent?
We can focus on the person of Peter Magyar, but just to support my claim with potentially two arguments. Yesterday, we have seen the highest turnout ever in the history of democratic elections in Hungary. And actually, we can observe much more than just a change in the government, because Hungary has been evolved to a sort of authoritarian regime. Now, a start of a redemocratization somehow equals to a regime change. But of course, you are entirely right. Peter Magyar has been socialized in the Fidesz party and actually has been part of that power structure in the second and third ranks. But notwithstanding this, I think even that phenomenon is not so different. So how, for example, regime change happened in Central and Eastern Europe in 1989, 1990, where at least in Hungary, former members of the ancient regime, so the previous regime, also played a very crucial role in the democratic transition. But with regard to the ideological characteristics of Peter Magyar, of course, he's a right-wing and conservative person, but first and foremost, I see him as a very successful political entrepreneur. Mm-hmm. And I think his main motivation will remain to keep actually this track record of astonishing political success, what he just created with the opposition party Respect and Freedom over the past couple of years. And I think what we will see from him is much more very pragmatic, output-oriented policymaking than anything that's really ideologically influenced.
So you're describing a champion of democracy, not necessarily a champion of liberal democracy, it sounds like. I mean, do you think we're going to see Peter Magyar rolling back these Orban policies that we've seen in the last couple of years? I'm thinking about the restrictions on LGBTQ rights, for example, in Hungary.
I think he got a mandate to redemocratize the country, and his political future depends on delivering on that mandate. In his victory speech, he referred actually to the equal right of every Hungarian citizen to live and love as he would like. So we have certain promises that he might also address the issue of the discrimination of the LGBTQ community in the country. On the other hand, as a rather realist political analyst, I expect that the focus will be on the non-divisive issues in the next couple of months, which primarily relates to the anti-corruption fight and the legislation in the country, bringing back the frozen and suspended EU funds, and potentially normalizing the relationship of Hungary with the European Union and in the broader sense in the Western alliance system.
How is he going to do that? Because we know that Hungary is still dependent on very cheap energy from Russia. How is he going to square this circle? Because you know that Brussels, the European Union, will be demanding that Hungary fall in line and cut those energy ties to Moscow.
I absolutely agree with you, and this is a very good question. I think we can start at the point that the new Hungarian foreign minister nominee, Ms. Anita Orban, who shares the same family name with the past prime minister, but they are not related, she stands with all of her professional career actually for the diversification of Hungary's energy supply and the phasing out of Russian fossil energy. So I think this is a credible promise that she might deliver on the fight. But I fully agree with you that because the Orban regime hasn't working on the diversification on the past 4 years, actually Hungary's dependency on Russian fossil fuel is bigger now than it used to be in 2022. This will be a large challenge. And personally, I don't think that the phase-out deadline at the end of 2027 set by the European Union is feasible for Hungary. It can be with regard of crude oil. There are alternative supply routes exist. The Adria pipeline via Croatia or the Odessa-Brody pipeline on Ukrainian territory. But if we take a look on the natural gas supply to the Turk Stream pipeline system, then I think the task is much, much bigger. And against that background, what I would expect is potentially a deadline extension request that might come sooner or later from the Hungarian government. And obviously, also a phase-out requires in some way the constructive and predictable behavior of Russia. So if I need to describe the potential future relationship of the Hungarian government with the Kremlin, I think that will be a cold but slow divorce.
What about Hungary's relationship with the U.S.?
During his visit in Budapest, J.D. Vance emphasizes that the United States will see every potential Hungarian government as a partner. And honestly, if we put the ideological connections between the MAGA movement and Fidesz aside, at least a government is much better aligned with United States interest than Fidesz, particularly when it comes to China. And also the energy cooperation agreements that were signed between the Trump administration and Fidesz, and which also serve actually the phase out of Russian energy, can continue actually in a very smooth way between the two administrations or two governments in the future. So I don't think that this change in the government will put an end to a closer cooperation that just a couple of days or weeks ago by the Hungarian government was highlighted as actually the golden era of transatlantic relationship between Washington and Budapest.
Okay, Daniel Hegedus, we appreciate your time and your insights on what's been, I'm sure, a very busy day. Thank you.
And we want to speak now about what Peter Magyar's election victory means for the rest of Europe. I am joined here in the studio by Milan Nis. He is here, and he is a Russia and Eastern European analyst with the German Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome to the program, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
What's your reaction to what we've just seen transpire?
Wow, but at the same time, it's a reminder that the world is crazy, but sometimes we are back to old politics when even if a populist ruler and leader and strong leader like Viktor Orban is in power for 16 years, people have enough of this, fed up, and old tricks don't work anymore.
We heard the Kremlin spokesperson speaking a short while ago, talking about how they'll continue to pursue their relationship with Hungary. Do we have a sense yet about how Peter Magyar is going to position vis-a-vis Russia?
Well, we don't have too much Peter Magyar is he's untested. He's a new politician, but I think he will be extremely careful towards Moscow. Also because he doesn't know what exactly has been signed before by Viktor Orban's government. There are these old dependencies. Hungary that he will inherit is still dependent on cheap Russian gas and oil. Also, there is this project for nuclear power plant, Paks 2. So I think he will be very careful. And he also can rely on advice of his team. The incoming foreign minister, Anita Orban, has done a PhD, or she's expert on Russia and energy, and others.
How about when we talk about Ukraine? Because Viktor Orban, he deliberately ran an anti-Ukrainian campaign. Does his defeat now mean that Hungarians want to support Ukraine, even if it costs more money or serious money?
In the campaign, Peter Magyar was careful not to be maneuvered to a completely pro-Ukrainian politician. Viktor Orban tried to sort of dubbed him as Zelensky's puppet. I think it's fair to say that they will unblock. They will not be a spoiler on Ukraine, on EU policies, but they are not enthusiastic supporters of Ukraine either. Plus, there is this issue of a Hungarian minority in Transcarpathia in Ukraine, and Viktor Orban will be breathing on their neck in a similar way as in Poland. Kaczynski's PiS party was waiting for any mistakes of Donald Tusk, the current prime minister, towards Germany, and they dubbed him as a sort of German traitor or ally. The same, I think, Orban will try on Peter Magyar. So it will be a divisive issue, but I think main things on the loan or on EU accession talks with Ukraine will be unblocked. The effect of it will be that other member states that were hiding behind Hungarian's veto will now have to be more clear about their own position. He
wasn't as shy when it came to talking about Europe, however, we have to say. So tell us a little bit more about what you think this now means to Europe, especially given that, you know, Viktor Orban was very often one of the big blockers of many efforts on the European side. Sometimes, you know, he had to be sent out of the room while a vote was happening, for example.
I think this is the end of Hungarian exception and paradox. Hungarian society is not very pro-Russian in itself. Hungarian ruling elite around Fidesz was very pro-Russian for their own personal interests. And also Hungarian society is very pro-European. So I think we will see Hungary back in the European mainstream. They also need it for their economic situation. The budget deficit is one of the worst in the EU. I think Peter Magyar already announced that his first trip abroad will not go to Brussels, but will be to Warsaw. We will see Polish-Hungarian tandem emerging in European politics. They are allies within the European People's Party. So Donald Tusk's Platforma, the ruling party in Poland, and Peter Magyar's party. But this is still a big unknown, this new winning party in Hungary. They will have 137 members of parliament that are totally new to politics, and their new ministers and so on, in a system which was tweaked through constitutional majorities to the needs of Orban's Fidesz party, and it will be a minefield.
Do you think it's the last we've heard of Viktor Orban?
No, of course not. As he said in his speech after accepting defeat, he said, we were still supported by 2.5 million voters, which is a strong basis. And from tomorrow, he will start thinking about how to get back, either in 4 years, or he will wait for any mistakes by the new government, which raised a lot of expectations to explore.
I'd like to ask you about how the election itself unfolded. You know, there were many reports about Russian attempts to interfere in the Hungarian election on Orban's behalf itself. You know, the fact that he has lost, what does this tell you now about the limits of Russian influence operations within Europe?
I think they lost their most important partner and client in the European system. So I think they will double down on other subversions because their interest is very clear, very rational. They want Europe weaker and less united. And Viktor Orban was playing a role in that, but there are other players. I think they will also adjust their playbook on other countries. There are elections in Slovakia next year, which has a more pro-Russian population. I think they will double down there. But big elections are next year in France. So I think Russian playbook will just adjust, and we will see more of these hybrid influences. The paradox of Hungarian elections was that Viktor Orban was not asked if he needs help. The Russians were doing it. The same from Washington. G.D. Vance came to embrace him with a message which completely sort of disrupted the main Orban's message of peace. I mean, he came as the personification of war the U.S. is leading or waging on Iran. So what was really, to me, the big surprise was how chaotic the main messages of Fidesz and their own campaign became in the last week, including this J.D. Vance visit, which came in a very, very bad timing.
Milan Nis, joining us from the German Council on Foreign Relations with more on the Hungarian elections. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.